It's a very important stop for us. Thank you, Jean-Robert, for setting the scene as well and for explaining what are the core values which underpin our Make Europe Great for All campaign. And indeed, the idea we have in mind with this campaign is to give our member associations and all those who want to join in, because it is an open campaign, to give them the tools to occupy the public debate in the coming months, and to put there the values we believe in and the values which we think should be at the core of the European building processes: equality, solidarity, inclusiveness, so that our democracies really become real and for all. We have here with us friends from Eastern Europe, because with Raffaella indeed we thought that there is a more and more visible divide. Besides all the divisions and the dividing lines we see in Europe today, there's one which is occurring in the latest period between the East and the West. And there's also maybe some kind of lack of understanding, of knowledge, of the realities which underpin the rise of the regressive movements, which gain a lot of popularity not only among their own public but also in Western media. So we are very lucky to have here with us both practitioners from civil society camp, people which work every day on projects, on all kinds of campaigns and actions to defend access to rights for all, but also more and more simply to survive, to counter attacks by their governments, because indeed, as you are all aware, there's this rise of a wave of attacks, more or less direct to civil society, and there are of course some gloomy places in the Eastern Europe where it happens in a very concrete and very severe manner. And Raffaella said that we are monitoring, as a European network, we are monitoring these attacks, but we try to go beyond the monitoring and beyond alerting the attention of the public institutions. We try to build networks of solidarity, and we try to put people, to connect people, so that we can organize a coordinated response to this. And I think that the debate today is also an opportunity to learn from this situation and to learn from different experience on how civil society reacts. I will introduce you for our first testimony, Veronika Mora from Hungary. She is director of Okotás Foundation, which is an environmentalist foundation working for environment issues in Hungary, but more and more building coalitions to resist and to oppose the government policies, the government discourse. And we must say that indeed in some gloomy countries like Hungary, and there are some others, we have also a Polish colleague, and it's quite contagious. Sometimes civic disobedience, as you said, becomes really the last resort form of freedom of speech, and I think that Hungarian colleagues are really good in being disobedient. Thank you, Vera, for being with us, and please tell us a little bit about the Hungarian context and how do you cope with it.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the European Civic Forum and Archie for inviting me. I hope I will live up to the expectations. Just a few words about my organization first. It's true that 25 years ago we started out as a foundation created to support the environmental NGO movement in Hungary. But over time our scope has broadened, and now we work towards strengthening and developing civil society in Hungary, primarily through providing grants, training, technical assistance to civic organizations. I was asked to speak about the civic experience in Hungary and what organizations can do against it. I'm afraid that by now democratic backsliding that was experienced in Hungary for the last decade has become very well known all over Europe. This process has manifested itself in many ways including the takeover of the media, the constitutional court, the centralization and nationalization of the public education system, and more recently attacks also on the academic sector. Attacks on civil society and shrinking civil space is another symptom of democratic backsliding in Hungary. But I should also mention probably that all this is also coupled with social policies, or rather the absence of social policies that leave the poor and the vulnerable in Hungary completely helpless. Over the past years, with the takeover of the independent media, the fragmented and weak political opposition, civil society organizations really remain the last truly independent actors or independent factors in Hungary. And probably this is why 7 years ago, the Hungarian government basically launched a campaign that tried to discredit and restrict the freedom of civil society organizations to work and to act. This has been shown by various studies and analysis, and it included smell campaigns, the withdrawal of finances or making finances inaccessible for independent organizations, and also more recently legal restrictions. The first time when the government's, let's say, anti-civil society campaign became very visible was in 2014, and that was the attack on the so-called EEA grants NGO program. The EEA grants is a funding mechanism or support provided by Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, which are not EU members. So provided by these countries to the less developed EU member states. Among them to NGOs. And my foundation has been the operator of this NGO program, meaning that we were responsible for distributing and managing the grants, and so we become the focus of the first communication campaign trying to vilify us as politically biased, and later on also as cheaters and frauds. However, the campaign also aimed at the grantees, the beneficiaries of this program, and that made clear that the government aimed at smearing and vilifying independent civil society organizations, particularly those that work on human rights, anti-corruption issues, women's rights, LGBT, and later on, a few years later, also on refugees and asylum seekers. This campaign, which focused on the EEA Norway Grants NGO program, included, as I said, communication media campaigns where high-ranking government officials made really denigrating and vilifying claims about ourselves and the beneficiaries of the program, but also harassing administrative inspections by various control agencies and tax authority, and it peaked in September 2014 in a police raid at all offices, and then the consequent legal battles, which found the government's accusation of completely groundless. This debate, or this conflict, was resolved towards the end of 2015 with an agreement between the donor countries, that is to say Norway and the Hungarian government, but that didn't stop the Hungarian government to continue its anti-civil society activities or anti-civil society campaign. However, on a positive note, I believe that this also had a positive effect on civil society in Hungary. In very many ways, it sent a wake-up call across the sector to organizations and made them realize the homework that they neglected to do in the previous decade. In Hungary, as elsewhere in Central Europe, civil society started to develop, of course, after the, or around and after the political transition in the early 90s, then the number of organizations kind of boomed and the sector started to develop very quickly. However, from the early 2000s until like 2010, the state or the situation of the civil sector sort of stabilized, but in retrospect, you could also say that stagnated. Many civil society organizations were engaged implementing one project after the other and reporting to the donors without really trying to innovate or trying to find alternatives, new solutions to the old problems. And they also neglected to talk to the people, actually, and to create constituency, create a broad circle of supporters who understand and value the work of civil society organizations and who acknowledge and appreciate the role and the functions they fulfill in a society. This was also the reason why it was so easy to attack civil organizations and why there was no general, huge, big uproar around this. So we realized that we need to do, as civil society organizations, we need to do more. And we need to make up for this lost decade when there was no real progress and development. What is needed is, I usually talk about the 4 C's. And these 4 C's being constituency, communities, communication, and coalitions. About constituencies, I was just speaking about, meaning that civil society organizations need to build a more broader, more solid basis in their societies. But this could be started in my conviction, it is my conviction that it could already started from the ground, from the grassroots up, from a very small community level. So we need to create communities of active citizens that are willing and able to stand up for themselves, to advocate and to participate in public matters. Of course, this doesn't work without communication. Communication is the tool to create the communities and the constituency. But also, it's an important tool to seek support also in financial terms, which is now essential under the circumstances of Hungarian civil society organizations, which are basically cannot access public funding or EU funding distributed by the Hungarian government. And last but not least, coalitions are also needed, that civil society organizations would stand up for themselves and for one another and be there for one another if any of them comes under attack. How does it work in Hungary? The government's anti-civil society campaign kind of quietened down in 2016, only to become more intensive at the beginning of last year, when the government started talking about plans to somehow restrict or even eliminate critical civil society voices and organizations that work for human rights, that work for refugees and asylum seekers. Soon they published a draft legislation which aimed at stigmatizing foreign funding and stigmatizing organizations that receive funding from abroad, be it public or private, individual funding or finances. In response to this, about 30 major civil society organizations started to come together and discuss regularly at the beginning of last year. These 30-something organizations included the major human rights organizations, community organizer, community development organizations, women's rights organizations, some environmental NGOs. So basically from across all areas, all issues, organizations participated in these discussions. And out of this coalition and the campaign called the Civilization was born. Throughout spring and summer last year, this coalition together stood up against the stigmatization legislation on foreign funding and organized street demonstrations, a protest in the Parliament Justice Committee session when they were discussing this legislation, press conferences, and also international solidarity. At the time, basically all intergovernmental organizations engaged in human rights issues, such as the Council of Europe, the OSCE, the UN, made statements condemning the government's plans, but also civil society organizations such as the European Civic Forum and others mobilized their members and collected supporting signatures to stand up for Hungarian civil society. Unfortunately, in spite of all this legislation was passed last June, which we, together with 23 Hungarian NGOs, challenged in the Constitutional Court and also made a petition to the European Court of Human Rights. And the coalition, even after passing the law, the coalition kept together and continued to work together. And it started also focusing on this building of constituencies. So last autumn, our central activity was to reach out to the countryside. Hungary is a country which is very much dual in the sense of there is the capital Budapest and the rest of the country, and the two are very different in many respects. And also civilization was quite Budapest-based, so what we did last autumn is to organize a roadshow of events all around the country in 6 places to introduce nationwide NGOs, to bring them closer to the local public and to link national issues to the local issues, because what we've also experienced that these national NGOs are often only seen by the people in the media, so we wanted to show that they are, actual people working in these organizations and actual, you can talk to them actually, and they are not just somebody far away on the television. The Hungarian government continued to try to restrict civil society organizations this year as well. We had general elections, parliamentary elections in April, and prior to that, the government started talking about introducing the new legislation which they dubbed the Stop Soros legislation. George Soros, the American philanthropist billionaire, being public enemy #1 of the government for a number of years now. This legislation was eventually passed after the elections in the 3rd version or 3rd draft, and what it does basically is it tries to sanction criminally those people who provide support to asylum seekers, such as lawyers providing legal aid to refugees. And also it aims to impose a kind of penal tax or penalty tax on the incomes of civil society organizations working on migration issues. So far, none of this legislation was implemented in practice. No organization suffered any consequences or any sanctions. However, we as civil society organizations must continue to be vigilant and continue to stand up for one another. And in the civilization campaign, we have basically created structures and ways and means how to be there for one another and how to be there, how to be able to act quickly and to raise solidarity both in Hungary and internationally should any of us come under attack or under harassment again. I could continue the story for another long while, but I think I was long enough, so I will pass the floor to colleagues. But should you have any questions, I will be around and we can talk. So thank you very much for the attention.